Chapter 8, Counter-Revolution of 1787, New Constitution, New Nation. Some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them, like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. I knew that age well. I belonged to it. But I know also that laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to Samuel Kerchival, July 12, 1816. The U.S. Constitution stands almost as American scripture, deified and all but worshipped as the holy book for the American civil religion of republicanism. The 1940 painting, Signing of the Constitution, by Howard Chandler Christie, captures the spirit of modern memories and mythology surrounding the Constitutional Convention, which was held in Philadelphia. The sun shines through the windows, which are conspicuously open, and delivers a halo of light upon the figure of the tall, erect George Washington. He stands on what resembles a religious altar, presiding over the delegates as they sign the sacred compact of American governance. Ben Franklin, himself an international celebrity by that time, sits prominently in the center as the influential young Alexander Hamilton whispers in his ear. Meanwhile, the father of the Constitution, James Madison, sits just below the altar, on Franklin's left. This is an illustrative depiction of the convention, glorious, dramatic, and mostly inaccurate. In reality, the shades were drawn and the windows locked. The delegates, at least those who were there on any given day, conducted their business in total, purposeful secrecy. 55 elite delegates, representing only 12 of the 13 colonies, Rhode Island refused to send a representative, took it upon themselves to secretly craft a new formula for government that they decided to be in the best interest of we the people. In the intervening years, the Constitution has become sacred indeed, an influential foundation used by politicians on all sides of the ideological spectrum to bolster their arguments and justify all number of decisions. In our modern age of hyperpartisanship, to disagree with one side or the other is to hold beliefs that are unconstitutional, if not treasonous. Still, Americans rarely consider the actual events surrounding the convention or try to understand the text of the document itself. Nor do they bother to question the very peculiarity of a 200-plus-year-old document informing the organization of the modern political and societal space. The founders, or in the case of the Constitution, the framers, are now held in the esteem of veritable deities, a pantheon of American civic saints. Many active citizens, especially on the conservative political right, argue for originalism, the need to follow and understand the Constitution as it was written back in the late 18th century. Indeed, originalism, in one form or another, seems ascendant in post-Reagan America. This is curious, given that many, though not all, founders were skeptical about such thinking way back when. Thomas Jefferson, though not in attendance in Philadelphia, he was then ambassador to France, remained a powerful intellectual influence on the framers, especially on his friend James Madison. Jefferson, at that time, and even more fervently as the years passed, was unimpressed by the growing veneration of the founding generation. He was increasingly persuaded that the earth belonged to the living, that each generation must reassess its governing structure, and that submit to the reasoning of our barbarous ancestors was a form of tyranny. Jefferson and his tradition, among those then pejoratively labeled Anti-Federalists, fervently believed that the Constitution must be open to amendment and regularly reassessed as the human mind and society progressed. Others, then and now, led by ardent nationalists such as young Alexander Hamilton, actively disagreed, preferring a fixed foundation of governance for millions yet unborn. That debate, of centralizing Federalists versus skeptical and fearful anti-Feds was a tumultuous legacy bequeathed to us all, one that is still raging. In order to take a side or even understand the dialogue, we must look backward, must shed the patriotic yarns taught in public schools from time immemorial, and understand the truth of events in the crucial post-revolutionary years of 1787 to 1789. Hard questions must be asked. Why did so many Americans adopt a more powerful government so soon after revolting against another? Did the Constitution serve to expand or limit American liberty? The answers might surprise you. As always, we must remember that nothing was inevitable. Not the ratification of the Constitution, the presidency of George Washington, or even the continued union of the 13 individual republics, or states. A deeper look at the actions and motivations of the framers uncovers certain darker forces at work, complicates blind veneration, but leads the modern reader closer to truth and context. That story begins with 55 prominent men and a Philadelphia summer. The coup d'etat of 1787. Genuine liberty requires a proper degree of authority. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the other the mass of the people. The masses seldom judge right. Give, therefore, to the first class a distinct, permanent share of government. Alexander Hamilton. Liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as the abuses of power. James Madison. Many Americans, especially coastal elites, believed the revolutionary spirit had gone too far, especially among the middling folk and commoners. Shays' Rebellion, state-level debt relief, seen almost as a form of modern welfare spending, and the apparent weaknesses of the continental government convinced many, often famous, elites that something had to be done. The problem, as Hamilton boldly labeled it, was one of how to rein in an excess of democracy. That, of course, doesn't sound all that revolutionary. Sounds rather contrary to the beloved spirit of '76. Hamilton and Madison, among other nationalists, those who believed in a more powerful central government, led the fight to amend the existing Constitution of the Allied States, the Articles of Confederation. They believed the state-level legislators were too close to their constituents and too lenient on debt and taxation. This, they believed, explained the post-war recession of the 1780s. Madison, Hamilton, and even Washington, among others, believed the state legislatures to be too susceptible to popular pressure, too democratic, one might say. Other nationalists, or as they would begin to call themselves, Federalists, sought external security through internal union. Think, then, of things in a new way. The 1787 convention was essentially an international meeting with envoys from 12 of 13 independent states, or countries, seeking to strengthen a loose confederation into one nation. Thus, some hoped, the U.S. could elude both internal and external diplomatic dangers. There would necessarily be trade-offs. As the authors of the essay, Federalist No. 7, would write, "To be more safe, we must risk being less free." Seen in this light, security, as much as politics or economics, motivated the drive towards centralization. This, of course, was all rather strange. Had not the very purpose of the revolution been to demand local representation and dispute governance from a distant body in London? Local rule, local decisions, the spirit of '76. How different, then, was centralized rule from, also distant, New York or Philadelphia, in an era when, as historian Joseph Ellis has reminded us, the average person strayed no more than 26 miles from his or her birthplace in an entire lifetime. A convention in Philadelphia was, for all intents and purposes, as far away as a parliament in London. Still they met, these rather few delegates in Philadelphia in 1787. Their mandate specified by the legal governing body of the day, the Confederation Congress, was simply to discuss the recommended changes to the Articles. And it is here, in the forthcoming decisions of the 55 delegates, where matters got complicated. Whatever else the Philly Convention and the final drafted Constitution was, it was unconstitutional, the Articles then being the law of the land. Almost immediately, these unelected delegates, chosen by the state legislatures and not we the people, decided unilaterally to ignore Congress and scrap the entire Articles of Confederation. They would, instead, write an entirely new constitution and present it to the states and the people. It should not surprise us that they decided thus. For the most part, the deck was stacked. Only Federalist-inclined men generally sought to attend, and most skeptics, including the state of Rhode Island, refused to take part. Immediately, the delegates voted to conduct all their actions in secret. The doors would be locked and the windows cloaked, and no letters about the proceedings or public proclamations would be allowed. This, they believed, would allow the men, and they were all men and white, to speak freely and frankly. Still, this sort of secrecy hardly seemed to gel with truly Republican principles. Yet so it would be, as a few dozen unelected, nationalist-inclined, prominent men secretly, and one could argue illegally, decided to ignore their charter and craft a new, more centralized government on behalf of the people of America. Furthermore, while the Articles of Confederation required unanimity among the states to be amended, the framers unilaterally decided to change the very rules of the game. Ratification of the new Constitution, they said, would require the consent of only 9 out of the 13 state legislatures. What an odd foundation, what dubious circumstances, for a document so revered by succeeding generations. Little wonder, then, that some have taken to calling the Constitutional Convention the framers' coup. Seen in a certain light, the sentiment rings true, even if the simplicity of this alternative reading is itself flawed. Of course, few Americans know this more complex history of the Constitution. How, then, could they not blindly revere the resultant document? Perhaps that's the point. The history that is written, the history that is widely taught, represents a conscious decision, a decision that is, more often than not, politically motivated. Cui bono, an economic interpretation of the Constitution. The Convention of Philadelphia is to consist of members of such ability, weight, and experience that the result must be beneficial. John Adams, in a letter to John Jay, May 8, 1787. The protection of property is the first object of government. James Madison, excerpt from Federalist No. 10. In 1913, the historian Charles Beard, an intellectual leader of the progressive movement and U.S. liberalism, wrote one of the most influential and controversial books in U.S. history, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. In his bombshell, Beard argued that the primary motive for most framers was to establish a strong central government that would protect their financial interests and enrich them personally. His narrative turned the founding myth on its head and shocked the academic world. To understand why Beard thought this way, we must examine just who these 55 delegates were. First off, remember what they weren't: common farmers or small shopkeepers. No, these were elites, individuals of wealth and in some cases fame. As mentioned earlier, all were male and white. More than half were college educated at a time when less than 1% of the population was. 58% were lawyers, 31% owned slaves, and 22% boasted large plantations. This will not surprise most readers, but there was something else. 20% were securities speculators or major bondholders. 11% speculated in Western land and hoped to turn a profit west of the Appalachians. Remember Shays' Rebellion. That revolt kicked off when small farmers were heavily taxed and required to pay in gold and silver to fund war bonds and continental paper money, both of which were at that point owned by wealthy speculators to a large extent. Most of the continental IOUs began in the hands of Revolutionary War soldiers and their suppliers, but amid rampant inflation and in desperate need of hard currency, most veterans sold off their bonds and their paper money to speculators for a fraction of the face value. Daniel Shays was one of them. Another was fellow military veteran Joseph Plum Martin. Martin went to his grave bitter about his lack of pay and overall treatment by the national government. He described how at war's end, the men in his unit who had paper bills sold them off to procure decent clothing and money sufficient to enable them to pass with decency through the country on their way home. By the time of the Constitutional Convention, only 2% of Americans, very few of them former soldiers or the original recipients, owned bonds. Nevertheless, in the years to come, a huge portion of the state and federal tax revenue would go to servicing and paying interest on those bonds. There was just one problem. In the minds of the wealthy, the Articles of Confederation was insufficient to enforce debts. After all, it had no power to tax, and the state legislatures were proving too responsive to clamors for debt relief from their constituents. Bondholders, creditors, and speculators, including many of the framers, were terrified of the new post-revolutionary power of uneducated, indebted farmers in their local governments. These men of wealth feared for their positions and power. After all, hadn't the framers believed that their class was best suited to govern society? Many credit-holding elites feared that they would never be paid and recoup the debts owed unless a strong federal government could collect taxes and had the power to enforce contracts. Beyond their personal interests, they also believed that only a strong central government could ensure a prosperous economy. Indeed, for many economic nationalists, the two key provisions of the Constitution fell under Article 1, Sections 8 and 10. These clauses gave the federal government the power to tax and prohibited the states from rescuing debtors or printing paper money. Some said that even if just those two provisions made it into the new Constitution, it would still be well worth voting for. But was it that simple? Certainly self-interest seemed to play a role, and no doubt the framers were mostly moneyed elites. Madison himself stated that the new federal government ought to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Without a doubt, the interests of the wealthy were front and center in the new Constitution. Still, Beard's overly simplistic economic determinism erases the agency of framers who were often enthusiastic nationalists and true believers. Indeed, Madison and Hamilton, thought of as fathers of the Constitution, were not themselves major creditors or bondholders. Besides, in the minds of these 18th century elites, only property and wealth could render a man politically independent, out of reach of bribery and economic intimidation. This, they believed, was the surest path to public virtue. Compromised by compromises, the emerging Constitution. No mention was made of Negroes or slaves in this Constitution, because it was thought the very words would contaminate the glorious fabric of American liberty. Dr. Benjamin Rush, in a letter to Dr. John Lettsom, September 1787. American children who grow up to be politically active adults, are led to believe, and they usually do so with all their hearts, that the Constitution was, from the first, an inherently democratic document. But what if it wasn't? What if, instead, it represented an attempt to drive a wedge between the people and their government and was ultimately little more than a compromise between factions? To understand the Constitution thus is not to forever tarnish its legacy, but rather to know it in its own context and to maintain a critical eye in contemporary political debates. That, of course, is a dangerous road, one sure to upset originalists and the powerful. There are, in fact, three distinct ironies about the American Constitution that emerged from the Philadelphia Convention. First, the framers intended to write a less democratic document, and, though it took generations, ended up with one of the more democratic countries on earth. Second, the delegates were responding to problems, state legislative excesses and economic anxiety, that were inflated and exaggerated. Nonetheless, they proceeded as though their biased opinions were self-evident truths. The document reflects that. And finally, as we shall see, Americans have the anti-Federalist opponents of the Constitution to thank for the democratic, civil libertarian protections found in the cherished Bill of Rights. Most arguments and eventual compromises centered on three key debates: over representation, the presidency, and slavery. Most in the stacked deck of Federalist framers desired a legislative branch that was less responsive than that of the local state governments. Larger districts and fewer total representatives, each congressman would now represent 10 times the constituents of an average state assemblyman, Madison believed was the best way to shield the federal government from too much popular pressure. It was necessary, he said, to extend the sphere of governance and create more distance between representatives and citizens. Some wanted senators to serve for life. 6-year terms was the compromise, but this was still a very long tenure in a time of annual elections at the state level. Madison thought that the Senate should be able to veto any state law. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina argued that no salary be allowed for senators because the Senate was meant to represent the wealth of the country. There were debates and disagreements on these points, but most framers agreed with the basic premise of distant, less responsive representation. The more difficult matter was how the legislative seats ought to be divided among the states. Large, populous states, backing the Virginia Plan, wanted a bicameral, two-house Congress with proportional representation in both chambers. Smaller states backed the New Jersey Plan and equal representation among each of the sovereign states. Eventually, the two sides came to a compromise by Connecticut and agreed on proportional representation in the House and 2 senators for each individual state. It remains so today. Furthermore, senators would not be elected by the people, but rather by state legislatures. This would not change until the early 20th century. When it came to representation, the Constitution crafted a legislature far less responsive than those of the states. Other debates surrounded the figure of the executive branch, the president. Under the Articles, there was no executive. After all, the states had just rebelled against a king. Many, like Hamilton, wanted a sort of Polish king, an executive elected for life. This was blocked, but the eventual outcome was a presidency vested with significant powers, vetoes, commander-in-chief authority, and pardons, and not constrained by term limits. Washington chose to set a precedent of stepping down after 2 terms, one that more than 30 consecutive presidents would follow, but he was not obliged to do so. Not until the 1950s was the 2-term limit written into a constitutional amendment. More interesting, the people would not directly elect the president. Rather, here too there would be distance between the government and the citizenry. The people would vote for electors who would then select the chief executive. Furthermore, elections would be an all-or-nothing game, with the electors from each state voting to give all the state's electoral votes to a candidate of choice, no matter how close the vote. The Electoral College still stands, and its existence explains how and why certain presidents, John Quincy Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, have been elected despite losing the popular vote. Original Sin, the 3/5 Compromise, a road to civil war? This Constitution is a better security for the institution of slavery than any that now exists. No power is given to the general government to interpose with respect to the property and slaves now held by the states. James Madison, in a speech reassuring delegates to the Virginia Constitutional Ratification Convention, June 1788. Perhaps the most infamous decision in the Constitution was the 3/5 Compromise. This representation arrangement was a concession to Southern states and their wealthy planters. According to the 3/5 rule, in force until the Civil War, each black slave would be counted as 60% of a person when calculating the number of House representatives allotted per state. Not that the slaves could vote, of course, they just counted. The 3/5 clause had momentous, often disastrous consequences. The math spoke for itself. The vote of one planter with 100 slaves would carry as much weight as that of 60 voters in the increasingly slave-free North. Southern states would punch above their weight in electoral politics for nearly a century, protecting and expanding slavery every step of the way. The Three-Fifths Compromise helps explain why 5 of the first 7 presidents were slave-holding Southerners. It also played a role in the agreement of the framers not to restrict the slave trade, the forcible and brutal importation of more Africans, until 1808. The result, in the intervening 20 years, more than 170,000 Africans were shipped across the Atlantic and into bondage in the southern United States. The prolific descendants of these slaves, those that survived, had populated the South when Civil War finally came in 1861. Because of the Three-Fifths rule, the very existence of slaves lent more power and authority to their masters. The irony, according to historian Woody Holton, was that, in this instance, slaves' interests would have been better served if they had not been considered persons at all. Nor can we explain away the Three-Fifths Compromise as merely a sign of the times, for many Americans were, indeed, appalled by this clause in 1787. One New Englander opposed to the Constitution wrote that the U.S. had to remain a collection of republics and not become an empire, because if America becomes an empire, the seat of government will be to the southward. Empire will suit the southern gentry. They are habituated to despotism by being the sovereigns of slaves. Even an eventual supporter and framer of the Constitution, Philadelphia's Gouverneur Morris, disliked the Three-Fifths Compromise and was horrified by the idea that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity tears away his fellow creatures and damns them to the most cruel bondages shall have more votes instituted for protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey. When it came to the Constitution as a final product, we must understand that the whole document was a compromise. Invisible common citizens were present in that room in Philadelphia. Left to their own devices, the framers would have produced a government even less responsive and more aristocratic, but as they wrote the document, they knew they would have to eventually get it ratified by the people. Hence, they softened the harshest clauses and generated the Constitution we all know, messy, flawed, and ever-changing. Forgotten Founders, the Anti-Federalists and American Freedom. A powerful and mighty empire is incompatible with the genius of republicanism. Anti-Federalist Patrick Henry. The very terms of the debate that followed, that of ratification, were flawed. Federalists and Anti-Federalists waged a semantic battle above all. As historian Pauline Maier reminds us, the words we use, especially names, shape the stories we tell. Anti-Federalist was a pejorative term used by the Feds and never accepted by most opponents of the Constitution. It was also illogical. Anti-Federalists were actually more in favor of federalism, in the traditional sense of the term, and local autonomy. Perhaps pro-rats, ratification, and anti-rats would be a more accurate, if conversely depreciative, pair of labels. It was also never a fair fight. The history we know and are taught is a Federalist history, a history, spoiler alert, of the victors. The Federalists wrote most of the documents, like the famous Federalist Papers, on which historians depend. Back at the time, they owned most of the newspapers in the new nation. They tended to live in big cities and trading hubs, along key transportation routes. They were also for something tangible, a new written constitution, rather than against such a document and internally divided as to the right course, like the Anti-Federalists. Still, there were ever so many Anti-Federalists of one stripe or another during the period of ratification, 1787 to 1789. They lived mostly in the West, or upstate, as in New York, far from the bustling cities and wealthy commercial elites. Historians estimate that about half the citizenry opposed the Constitution at the outset. Indeed, the Feds often got enough votes to ratify only by solemnly promising to immediately amend the Constitution. New Yorkers gave in only after Federalist New York City threatened to secede, and Rhode Island capitulated only after the other states imposed a trade boycott on the little state. There were also some rather famous citizens among the anti-Feds. Patrick Henry of Virginia, he of "Give me liberty or give me death" fame, was opposed to the end. So was Virginia's George Mason, a future university namesake. Others initially opposed the Constitution but finally acquiesced, in however lukewarm a fashion, such as Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Thomas Jefferson. The ratification debates were intense, and it was years before all 13 states adopted the Constitution. Some votes were close. Massachusetts was 187 to 168, New Hampshire 57 to 47, Virginia 89 to 79, New York 30 to 27, and Rhode Island 34 to 32. In other words, adoption of the Constitution we now revere was a near-run thing. And as close as these votes were, we must note who actually got to do the voting: white, free men. In some states, it was only those who owned property. Women, slaves, and Indians weren't consulted, a good thing as far as the Federalists were concerned. As we'll see, odds are they would have opposed an empowered national government. So just what did they fear, these various opponents of the Constitution? Simply put, they dreaded what the rebellious colonists had so feared: a president that became an executive monarch, a concern that has been partly vindicated given the increasingly imperial powers of today's presidency in foreign affairs, an aristocratic Senate, which was understandable given that the people didn't directly elect senators until 1913, a distant, unresponsive House with the power of federal taxation. Like Parliament, this is still an issue for libertarian conservatives in the modern Tea Party movement, and, of course, a standing national army. This, no doubt, was an outgrowth of bad memories from the Revolutionary era. Indeed, consider the text of the Declaration of Independence, the gripe that King George had kept among us, in times of peace, a standing army without the consent of our legislatures. A prominent Anti-Federalist in Virginia, John Tyler, asked at his state's ratifying convention whether "we shall sacrifice the peace and happiness of this country to enable us to make wanton war." Contemporary Americans, 17 years into an undeclared war on terror, might think it time to revisit Tyler's question. The point is that Anti-Federalists were neither history's villains nor simply its losers. They represented the political inclinations of a significant segment of 18th century Americans, which inclinations, some might argue, remain even in the 21st century. The Constitution proposed is designed not for yourselves alone, but for generations yet unborn. The principles, therefore, ought to be clearly and precisely stated, and the most express and full declaration of rights have been made. But on this subject, the Constitution is silent. Robert Yates, pen name Brutus. Historian Woody Holton has recommended a teaching experiment, one I used with my cadets when I taught at West Point. I'd end my class on the subject by asking random cadets to name their favorite right or privilege guaranteed by the Constitution, which cadets had sworn to support and defend. Inevitably, a hulking male Texan would offer the right to bear arms. Others would chime in with free speech, a free press, and freedom of religion. Then I'd ask how many of those rights were contained in the document approved at the Constitutional Convention. Met by blank, confused stares, I'd level the answer: 0. It's a trick question, of course. The Constitution, as first drafted and ratified by the states, was solely a structure of government document. All our most treasured protections are found in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, what became known as the Bill of Rights. Most staunch Federalists, in fact, insisted that the Constitution be ratified as is and opposed the Bill of Rights. This, of course, raises a salient, if uncomfortable, question. If the motive for the Constitution wasn't to safeguard liberty, what does that say about the document? Actually, it was the anti-Feds who insisted on, and strong-armed a promise for, a Bill of Rights during the contested ratification conventions. Do you enjoy freedom of speech, of assembly, the right to bear arms? Well, thank the oft-forgotten Anti-Federalists. It's possible, in fact, to argue that it was actually the Anti-Feds who hewed closer to the Republican principles of the Revolution, to the spirit of '76. Taking a fresh look at the Constitution's opponents also reminds us that there is value in studying our conflicts and, sometimes, focusing on history's losers. A Roof Without Walls, the Legacy of the Constitution. I suppose to be self-evident that the earth belongs to the living, that the dead have neither powers nor rights over it. Every constitution, then, and every law naturally expires at the end of each generation. If it be enforced longer, it is an act of force and not of right. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to James Madison, September 6, 1789. Barely a decade after revolting against an empire, the 13 former colonies of America made the conscious decision, no doubt egged on by their prominent elites, to graft a powerful federal government onto their separate states and, in Woody Holton's memorable words, launch an empire of their own. Why and how it happened, as we've seen, is rather complex. Of this much we can probably be sure. Without the experience of the war, it is unlikely there would have been any call for a centralized government. As Peter Onuf has stated, revolutionary war-making and state-making were inextricably linked. Wars demand powerful bureaucracies, and failures are unforgiving in the storm of conflict. The weaknesses and shortfalls of the Confederation Congress convinced many rebel leaders that something sturdier was necessary, but they did not convince them all. A powerful opposition to the Constitution and the national government persevered and fought centralization at every turn. These resistors would not vanish after ratification, but rather would form a new faction to oppose what they saw as the excesses of centralized power. There is irony, in a sense, in our contemporary deification of the Constitution across the political spectrum. Perhaps this can be explained by the ethnic, religious, and regional diversity of the early republic and our present nation. American nationalism was peculiar and was largely constitutional for a century or more, based on a document rather than a common ethnicity, a condition that perhaps exists even until today. It is the Constitution that has come to bind us. This, of course, is strange because in the 1780s and 1790s, it was that very Constitution that divided America. What is more, modern Americans forget that, in the end, the Constitutional Convention constructed a new federal government considerably less democratic than even the most conservative state constitutions. As Delegate Robert Morris said at the time, the new government was meant to suppress the democratic spirit. In a further irony, despite finishing a revolution against the British Crown just 5 years earlier, Hamilton and other like-minded framers believed that a respectable United States would have to become more, not less, like Britain. And still, something was lost in the movement towards a stronger constitution. Annual elections, congressional term limits, grassroots voting instructions from constituents, and popular control of the money supply. All these democratic measures, most of which dated back to the colonial era, were gone forever. We might wonder whether or not this was truly for the better. There was still another motivation for the Philadelphia Convention: elite fear. Shays' Rebellion and other grassroots revolts convinced many wealthy leaders that a strong central government with a standing army was necessary to quell future unrest. Seen in this light, the Constitution was meant to suppress, not safeguard, liberty, at least from the perspective of certain parties. The Southern planters, too, were gripped with fear. They remembered well that greatest slave revolt in American history, a part of the American Revolution, had recently occurred when many thousands of slaves flocked to the British lines. The new federal army would also, they surmised, be used to deter or quash future slave rebellions. Those new government powers quickly translated into action as, from 1789 to 1795, U.S. Army manpower increased fivefold, its budget threefold, and the size of the Navy by a factor of 60. In a sense, this establishment of a standing army, though modest by today's measures, appears counter to the revolutionary spirit and a repudiation of the values of 1776. The Constitution and the new army it helped to create also spelled doom for native tribes and unleashed a veritable bonanza in land sales in what was then the West. Sadly, the power of the post-revolutionary Native Confederation north of the Ohio River may have inadvertently signed the Indians' death warrant. Indian resistance had stymied land sales, which it was hoped would fund the Confederation budget, and helped motivate the centralization instinct among prominent speculators, many of whom became framers. They supported a powerful central government that could secure the land from Native Americans and ensure ample profits to boot. Perhaps a fresh, nuanced look at the Constitution's ratification ought to lead us to restructure our understanding of the era. Maybe rather than a simple revolution to republic narrative, there were actually numerous revolutions. One revolution surrounding independence, followed by a social, democratic revolution during the Confederation, then a different transformation, a constitutional revolution that sought to centralize power, ensure security, and work toward the creation of an American nation-state. That revolution has endured, but we must remember that, at least in its own day, it was a revolution against the excesses of democracy, an undemocratic counter-revolution of 1787. How then can the Constitution be, as so many Americans today insist it is, an infallible, divinely inspired document? It has, after all, been amended dozens of times. Furthermore, after 74 years, it ultimately failed. With the nation torn asunder by civil war, the original sin of slavery came home to roost. The death of hundreds of thousands of citizens was required to update and reimagine the Constitution. And so, as John Adams reminded his contemporaries long after the Revolution, divided we have ever been and ever must be. Years after the Constitution became the law of the land, establishing a new powerful federal government, Fisher Ames, a staunch Massachusetts Federalist, described the new American political mood. The fact really is that there is a want of accordance between our system of government and the state of our public opinion. The government is Republican, opinion is essentially Democratic. Either events will raise public opinion high enough to support our government, or public opinion will pull down the government to its own level. They must equalize. We Americans are still divided between democratic sentiments and Republican indirect governance. How else could someone who received 3 million fewer votes than his opponent have won the Oval Office in 2016? Conservatives and liberals alike are still playing out this old debate. It remains to be seen if the United States can be both Democratic and Republican, to find a balance, or, for that matter, in these highly divided times, whether we can maintain the Union itself. In its own way, the turmoil of the 18th century is with us still.